A prestigious airline, known for its luxury and exclusivity, finds itself at the center of a shocking scandal. A successful black businesswoman enters their priority lounge, only to be met with humiliation and blatant discrimination. Staff question her membership, mock her behind her back, and try to dismiss her dignity. But just moments later, she makes a decision that shakes the airline to its core, canceling a multi-million-dollar contract they couldn't afford to lose. What happens next ignites a movement no one saw coming, exposing the hidden culture of bias and sparking a wave of accountability in the industry. Stay tuned, this story is one you won't forget. Before we dive in, comment below and let us know where you're watching from. If stories about courage and justice inspire you, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more. The airport lounge hummed with an air of exclusivity, a sanctuary of muted luxury perched above the bustling terminals below. Conversations floated in soft murmurs, the clink of glassware punctuating the air like an orchestral symphony. Polished marble floors gleamed under recessed lighting that cast a warm glow on meticulously arranged seating. This was a space designed to whisper affluence, not shouted, a place where the world's privileged paused before their journeys. Amelia Harper stepped through the sleek glass doors with the practiced elegance of someone who had navigated these spaces before. Her tailored cream suit hugged her form with sharp precision, a statement of understated power. A leather briefcase hung from her hand, a simple but commanding accessory. Yet for all her confidence, she felt the weight of it, a subtle, familiar tension as gazes flickered toward her and then away. The quiet snap of judgment. "Good afternoon, ma'am." A young man in a crisp uniform greeted her with a tight smile. His clipboard rested against his chest, a badge of authority. "May I see your boarding pass and membership card?" Amelia reached into her briefcase, her movements deliberate, graceful. "Here you are," she said, offering the documents with a warm smile. The man's eyes darted to the card, his brow furrowing almost imperceptibly before he nodded. "Thank you," he said, though his voice lacked conviction. "One moment, please." With that, he disappeared behind the sleek marble counter, leaving Amelia standing in the middle of the lounge, her presence like a spotlight in a shadowed room. The air shifted, whispers stirred in the corners. A man in an expensive suit leaned closer to his companion, their laughter muffled but unmistakable. Amelia heard nothing distinct, but she had long mastered the art of reading the room. The tilted heads, the fleeting glances, the ever so slight lift of a brow, each was a quiet indictment. What is she doing here? Moments later, a woman emerged from behind the counter, her steps brisk, her expression sharp. Her red blazer and precisely coiffed blonde hair exuded authority, but not warmth. The name tag pinned to her chest read Heather McAllister. "Miss Harper," Heather began, her tone polished but with a brittle edge. She held up Amelia's membership card as if it were a counterfeit dollar. "Are you aware that this is the priority lounge?" Amelia's smile didn't falter, though her grip on the briefcase tightened. "I am," she replied evenly. "I've been a priority member for several years." Heather's eyes narrowed slightly as she glanced at the card and then back to Amelia. "I'll need further verification," she said, each word dripping with condescension. "Unfortunately, we've had some recent issues with unauthorized use of these cards." The insinuation landed like a slap in the quiet room. Amelia felt the flush of indignation rise in her chest but held it in check. She tilted her head, her voice calm but firm. "Is that so? Then by all means, verify it." Heather smirked, a small, deliberate curl of the lips. "I'll need a moment." As Heather retreated behind the counter, Amelia stood alone, the weight of every glance in the room pressing down on her like a physical force. She could hear it in the whispers now, faint but unmistakable. A woman near the bar muttered to her companion. Her words carried just enough to sting. She must have saved up for this. Amelia straightened her shoulders, her back rigid. She had endured this before. The quiet erosion of dignity that came with being questioned, challenged, reduced, always reduced. She had earned her place here, just as she had earned her place in every boardroom where she had fought to be seen as more than her skin. And yet, here she was again, on trial for existing in a space she had every right to inhabit. Heather returned, her expression smug. "It seems your membership is indeed valid," she said, the words stretched out as if reluctant to leave her mouth. "However, we do have certain expectations of decorum in this lounge." Amelia's jaw tightened. but her voice remained steady. Decorum? Heather tilted her head, her smile widening. Yes, we expect our guests to reflect the exclusivity of this space. It was an insult wrapped in a veneer of professionalism, but the sting was unmistakable. Amelia took a slow, deliberate breath, her composure unbroken. Thank you for the clarification, she said coolly. Heather blinked, as if surprised by the lack of an outburst. But Amelia had already turned away, her heels clicking against the polished floor as she moved toward a seat in the corner of the lounge. She set her briefcase down, her movements precise, deliberate. She would not let them see her falter. As she pulled out her phone, her fingers hovered over the screen. The memory of Heather's smirk lingered. And with it, the murmurs, the laughter, the unspoken questions. This wasn't about a card or a lounge. This was about 1,000 small cuts. The unrelenting erosion of belonging. Amelia tapped a contact on her phone and brought it to her ear. Anderson, she said, her voice low but resolute. We need to talk about the Luxair contract. There's been an incident. At the counter, Heather laughed softly with another staff member, oblivious to the storm she had just unleashed. Amelia ended the call, her hand lingering on her phone, her resolve solidified like steel. If this was to be another battle, she would fight it on her terms. The quiet storm in the lounge continued, but Amelia Harper was no longer just a spectator. The lounge had settled back into its rhythm, or so it seemed. Amelia Harper sat near the window, her posture composed, her face unreadable. Beyond the glass, planes taxied across the tarmac, their hulking forms outlined against the fading afternoon light. It was a scene of order and precision, but beneath its surface, tension simmered like a dormant volcano. Amelia's phone lay face down on the table, a silent sentinel to the battle she knew was unfolding. She had made the call to Anderson Quinn not as a plea but as a declaration. This was no isolated slight, it was a pattern, one she was determined to break. Across the room, Heather McAllister stood at the counter, her red blazer like a beacon of misplaced authority. Her confidence had only grown since her earlier exchange with Amelia. She whispered something to a junior staff member, a young man with a nervous energy, who glanced furtively in Amelia's direction before scurrying off. Amelia caught the exchange and the slight smirk that lingered on Heather's lips. It wasn't the first time she had faced this brand of quiet hostility. Wrapped in the trappings of professionalism, it was the kind of disdain that didn't shout but whispered. The kind that didn't shove but nudged just enough to remind you that you didn't quite belong. She felt it in the way the room shifted when she entered. In the way conversations paused just long enough to acknowledge her presence before continuing with a little less warmth. It was in the glances that slid over her like water, searching for cracks in her composure. And in the way Heather had wielded protocol as both shield and sword. A loud laugh from the bar drew her attention. A man in a tailored gray suit was leaning over the counter, his voice carrying across the lounge. Did you see her face? He said, his tone conspiratorial. I mean, who walks into a place like this and thinks they belong? The bartender, a woman with a forced smile, nodded politely but didn't reply. The man's companion, a younger man with a sleek briefcase, chuckled softly. She must have thought this was her big moment, he said, his words dripping with mockery. Amelia's fingers tightened around the edge of her phone. She didn't turn to look at them, didn't give them the satisfaction of her reaction, but the heat of their words pressed against her back, a relentless reminder of the silent war she fought every day. Moments later, her phone buzzed. The name on the screen read Anderson Quinn. She picked it up, her voice steady as she answered. Amelia. Anderson's voice was calm but laced with urgency. I spoke with Langston. He's the regional director for Luxair. He's on his way to the lounge now. I made it clear that this situation needs immediate attention. Good, Amelia replied, her tone clipped. They need to understand this isn't just about me. It's about the culture they've cultivated. There was a pause on the line. Do you want me to escalate this further? Anderson asked. Amelia glanced toward the counter, where Heather was now typing furiously into a computer. Not yet, she said. Let's see how they handle this. But be ready. As she ended the call, the glass doors to the lounge hissed open, and Edward Langston stepped in. His presence was immediate, his tailored suit and silver tie a sharp contrast to the casual arrogance that permeated the room. He scanned the lounge briefly before his gaze landed on Amelia. Miss Harper, he greeted her, his voice low and formal. I'm Edward Langston, the regional director for Luxair. May I sit? Amelia gestured to the seat across from her. Of course, she said, her tone polite but firm. Langston settled into the chair, his posture rigid. First, let me extend my deepest apologies for the treatment you've received. It is unacceptable, and I take full responsibility. Amelia studied him, her expression unreadable. Responsibility, she repeated, her voice measured. And what does that mean in practice? Mr. Langston? Langston hesitated, his gaze flickering toward Heather, who was now standing stiffly behind the counter, her earlier confidence replaced by unease. It means corrective action, he said carefully. We will address the behavior of the staff involved and ensure this doesn't happen again. Amelia leaned forward slightly, her eyes locking onto his. Corrective action? What about accountability? What about addressing the underlying culture that allows this to happen in the first place? Langston shifted in his seat. I understand your frustration, Miss Harper. No, Amelia interrupted, her voice sharp but controlled. You don't understand what it's like to walk into a room and be questioned. Dismissed, diminished. You don't understand what it's like to fight for a place you've already earned. Only to be told, subtly or otherwise, that you don't belong. Langston's jaw tightened, but he didn't look away. You're right, he said finally. I don't understand, but I want to make this right. Amelia sat back, her gaze unwavering. Then you need to start by acknowledging the problem isn't just Heather or her staff. It's Luxair. It's the culture you've built and allowed to thrive. Langston nodded slowly, the weight of her words settling over him. I'll take this to the executive team, he said. We'll conduct a full review of our policies and training. Amelia's lips pressed into a thin line. That's a start, she said, but actions speak louder than words. Mr. Langston, I suggest you act quickly. Langston rose to his feet, his expression grave. You have my word, Miss Harper. As he turned to leave, Heather approached him, her face pale. Mr. Langston, he held up a hand, silencing her. We'll talk, he said, his voice cold, but not here. Amelia watched them disappear into the back office, the tension in the room thick enough to cut. She allowed herself a small breath. But the fight was far from over. This was only the beginning. The lounge had fallen into an uneasy stillness, like the pause between lightning and thunder. Edward Langston's departure left an invisible tremor in the air, and those remaining seemed to shrink into their plush seats, eager to avoid becoming collateral damage. Amelia Harper sat back in her chair, her spine straight and her expression poised. But her mind raced like the planes beyond the window, each thought circling her frustration, her resolve. Heather McAllister reappeared from the back office, her face pale, her confidence visibly shaken. She glanced toward Amelia, then quickly away, her movements no longer brisk but jittery. The staff around her whispered among themselves, their camaraderie fractured under the weight of Langston's brief but pointed rebuke. Amelia could feel the shift, small, subtle, but real. The quiet superiority that had cloaked the lounge's occupants had turned into discomfort. Then fear. She had disrupted their sanctuary, her presence forcing them to confront something they had all mastered the art of ignoring. But it wasn't enough. Amelia's phone buzzed against the table, breaking the stillness. She picked it up and saw Anderson Quinn's name flash across the screen. She stepped into the corridor outside the lounge, her heels clicking sharply against the polished floor. Amelia, Anderson began, his voice calm but with an edge of tension. Langston just called me. He claims they're taking this seriously. But I don't trust it. Corporate's already circling the wagons. I expected as much, Amelia replied, her tone even. They think this will blow over if they shuffle a few policies and send out a press release. Anderson hesitated. What's your next move? Amelia leaned against the wall, her gaze drifting toward the window overlooking the runway. I'm not letting this go. Not this time. You're playing a dangerous game. Amelia, Anderson warned. These people will protect their image at all costs. Amelia's voice hardened. So will I. Back inside the lounge, Heather's demeanor had shifted entirely. Her usual smug confidence had been replaced by a veneer of professionalism so thin it was nearly transparent. She approached Amelia's table cautiously, her hands clasped in front of her like a penitent student. Miss Harper, she began, her voice tight. I'd like to extend my apologies for earlier. There was a misunderstanding. Amelia looked up, her expression calm but piercing. A misunderstanding? Heather swallowed hard, her hands tightening around each other. Yes. I didn't mean for you to feel unwelcome. Amelia leaned back in her chair, her gaze unyielding. Is that so? Tell me, Heather, if it were someone else, someone who looked different from me, would you have questioned their membership? Would you have insisted on verification? Heather's mouth opened, but no words came out. She cast a desperate glance toward her colleagues, but they avoided her gaze. You don't need to answer, Amelia said, her voice like steel, because we both know the truth. As Heather retreated, the lounge doors hissed open again. This time, a group of executives entered, their movements brisk and deliberate. They were led by a woman in a gray suit, her sharp features betraying a mix of irritation and concern. Amelia recognized her from industry events. Margaret Delaney, Luxair's chief operations officer. Margaret approached Amelia directly, bypassing Heather and the other staff entirely. Miss Harper, she said, extending a hand. I'm Margaret Delaney. May I have a word? Amelia shook her hand, her grip firm. By all means. They moved to a quieter corner, where Margaret wasted no time. I want to personally apologize for the treatment you received today. It was unacceptable and not reflective of Luxair's values. Amelia tilted her head slightly, her expression unreadable. Not reflective of your values? Margaret, I've heard that line before. And yet, here we are. Margaret's composure wavered for a fraction of a second before she recovered. I assure you, Miss Harper, we are taking immediate steps to address this. The staff involved will face consequences. And we are reviewing our training programs to ensure. Save it, Amelia interrupted, her voice sharp but controlled. This isn't about training programs. This is about a culture that tolerates, even encourages, behavior like this. And it's not just about me. How many others have been dismissed, humiliated, made to feel small in spaces like this? How many times has Luxair looked the other way? Margaret opened her mouth to respond, but Amelia held up a hand. If you're serious about change, show me. Words are cheap, action isn't. Margaret nodded, her expression tight. You're right, we'll do better. Amelia's eyes narrowed. I'll be watching. By the time Margaret and her entourage left the lounge, the atmosphere had shifted yet again. The hum of conversation had returned, but it was quieter now. Subdued, Amelia gathered her things, her movements deliberate. As she walked toward the exit, the room seemed to hold its breath. Heather watched her go, her face pale and her hands trembling. The weight of what had transpired pressed heavily on her. But Amelia didn't look back. She didn't need to. Outside the lounge, the airport buzzed with its usual chaos. But for Amelia, it was the quiet before the next storm. This was no longer just about a single incident or a single lounge. It was about a system, a deeply ingrained, insidious system that thrived on silence and complicity. Amelia Harper had no intention of being silent. Not this time. The airport buzzed with its usual chaos. But for Amelia Harper, every step she took toward the exit felt deliberate. Weighted. The air outside the lounge was no freer than inside it. Just filled with a different kind of tension, one that spoke of too many moving parts. Too many stories colliding. She passed hurried travelers, airport workers, and polished executives, all moving with purpose, all unaware of the storm brewing just beneath the surface. Her phone buzzed again. It was Anderson. Where are you? He asked, his voice tight with concern. I'm leaving the lounge, she replied, but I'm not done. Anderson sighed audibly. I figured as much. Langston called again. He's scrambling to contain this. Margaret's going to push for damage control. But you know how this goes. They'll promise the moon and hope you let it drop. Amelia stopped near a tall window overlooking the runway. Planes glided effortlessly across the tarmac, oblivious to the weight of human conflict. Then they've underestimated me, she said. Her voice was calm, but her words carried an edge, sharp and unyielding. This isn't going to disappear with an apology or a corporate memo. This time, they'll feel it. The ride home was silent, save for the low hum of the car's engine. Samuel, her driver, sensed her mood and didn't attempt small talk. Amelia stared out the window, the city rushing past in blurred streaks of light and shadow. Her reflection stared back at her, a face that carried decades of battles fought in boardrooms, courtrooms, and public spaces where her presence was always a statement, even when she wished it wasn't. Her thoughts churned. The incident at the lounge wasn't isolated. It was a symptom of something larger. She thought of the countless times she'd been made to feel like an outsider in spaces she had every right to inhabit. Each moment was a thread. And today's encounter was just the latest in a tapestry of indignities woven over a lifetime. By the time Amelia stepped into her townhouse, the quiet was almost suffocating. She tossed her briefcase onto the sleek black sofa and paced the room, her heels clicking against the hardwood floor. She couldn't shake the memory of Heather's smirk, Margaret's carefully rehearsed apology, or the whispers that had filled the lounge. They were all echoes of the same unspoken truth, that her presence disrupted their sense of order, their illusion of exclusivity. Her phone buzzed on the coffee table, pulling her from her thoughts. It was a message from an unknown number. "Miss Harper, this is Claire. I work with the Tribune. I was in the lounge today and saw everything. If you're willing, I'd like to speak with you about what happened." Amelia stared at the message, her mind racing. She had no intention of letting the incident fade into obscurity. But going public carried risks. The media could amplify her voice, but it could also distort it, reducing her experience to a soundbite, a headline. Still, the alternative silence was no longer an option. The next morning, Amelia met Claire in a quiet cafe downtown. Claire was younger than Amelia had expected, her dark curls framing a face that was both eager and serious. She carried a notebook and a recorder, but she placed them on the table without turning them on. "I just want to hear your story," Claire said, her voice gentle but firm. "And if you're comfortable, we can go from there." Amelia studied her for a moment before nodding. "All right," she said, "but understand this. I'm not looking for sympathy. I'm looking for accountability." For the next hour, Amelia recounted the events at the lounge. She spoke of Heather's insinuations, Margaret's empty promises, and the unspoken dynamics that had permeated the room. Claire listened intently, scribbling notes but never interrupting. When Amelia finished, Claire leaned back, her expression thoughtful. "This isn't just a one-off incident," Claire said. "This is systemic." Amelia nodded. "It's the culture. They don't see it because they don't have to. But for people like me, it's a constant undercurrent." Claire's eyes narrowed. "Would you be willing to go on record? If we can tie this to other cases, employees, customers, anyone who's experienced something similar, it could expose a pattern." Amelia hesitated, the weight of the decision pressing against her. Speaking out would mean inviting scrutiny, opening herself up to attacks from those who would rather maintain the status quo. But it would also mean shining a light on the truth, a truth too many had been forced to endure in silence. "Let's do it," she said finally. "But I want this to be more than a headline. I want it to matter." That evening, as the city settled into its nocturnal rhythm, Amelia sat in her study, poring over documents on her laptop. She had begun compiling evidence, emails, testimonials, and reports from others who had faced similar treatment at Luxair. Each story was a piece of a larger puzzle, one that painted a damning portrait of the airline's culture. Her phone buzzed with another message, this time from Anderson. "Langston called again. They're worried. I think you've rattled them." Amelia allowed herself a small, fleeting smile. "Good," she murmured to herself. But she knew the real battle was only just beginning. The next morning, Claire's article hit the front page of the Tribune. Behind the curtain, Luxair's culture of exclusion. Prominent businesswoman Amelia Harper speaks out after being humiliated in the airline's priority lounge, shedding light on a troubling pattern of discrimination. The article was thorough, weaving Amelia's story with accounts from former employees and customers who had faced similar indignities. Within hours, it went viral, sparking outrage on social media. The hashtag Justice for All began trending, with people sharing their own experiences of being dismissed, belittled, or excluded. At Luxair headquarters, the fallout was immediate. Executives scrambled to contain the damage, issuing a carefully worded apology that only fueled the public's ire. For Amelia, the storm was validation, but it was also a reminder of the long road ahead. She stood by her window, watching the city hum with life, and felt the weight of her decision settle over her. This wasn't just about one lounge or one airline. It was about dismantling the unspoken rules that had kept people like her on the margins for far too long. Amelia Harper wasn't backing down. The fight had only just begun. The morning air carried an unusual weight as Amelia Harper stepped into the sleek black sedan waiting outside her townhouse. The usual hum of the city seemed muted. as if it too were bracing for the aftershocks of the story that had erupted the day before. Claire's article had done more than stir conversation, it had ignited a firestorm. News outlets were running with the headline, and Luxair's carefully cultivated image was beginning to crack. Amelia's phone buzzed with notifications, messages of support, media inquiries, and a handful of vitriolic responses that she had anticipated but still stung to read. It was one thing to face quiet discrimination in a room. It was another to see strangers dissect your dignity in public forums. She silenced the phone and focused on the path ahead. She wasn't in this for validation or sympathy. She was in this to change the rules of the game. At Luxair's corporate headquarters, the air was charged with urgency. Margaret Delaney sat at the head of a long conference table, her sharp gray suit reflecting her no-nonsense demeanor. Around her, a cadre of executives shuffled papers and whispered nervously. "This is a disaster," one man muttered, his voice barely audible but thick with panic. "It's more than a disaster," Margaret said, her tone clipped. "It's a reckoning." Edward Langston shifted uncomfortably in his seat. "We've issued the apology. We've committed to reviewing our policies." "It's not enough," Margaret snapped, cutting him off. "Do you think a hollow apology is going to placate a woman like Amelia Harper? This isn't about damage control. This is about survival." The room fell silent, her words landing like a gavel. Margaret turned her attention to Langston. "I need you to get in front of this. Meet with her again if you have to. Convince her that we're serious about making amends." Langston nodded reluctantly, already dreading the conversation. Meanwhile, Amelia was preparing for her own battle. Anderson Quinn had joined her at her office. A sleek, modern space that felt like an extension of her unwavering resolve. Together, they mapped out their next steps, poring over documents and strategy. "They're going to try to silence you," Anderson warned. "They'll offer you everything under the sun to make this go away." Amelia's gaze was steady. "Then they've misjudged me. This isn't about money or perks. It's about accountability." Anderson nodded, his respect for her deepening. "If we're going to take this further, we'll need more voices, more evidence. We have to show this isn't just about one incident." Amelia tapped her pen against the desk, her mind racing. Claire mentioned that some former employees might be willing to speak out. "Let's start there." That afternoon, Claire arranged a meeting with two former Luxair employees, Devon, a former lounge attendant, and Maria, a flight attendant who had resigned years ago. They met in a private conference room, their nervous energy palpable. "Thank you for coming," Amelia said, her voice warm but firm. "I know this isn't easy." Devon nodded, his hands clasped tightly on the table. "I've wanted to speak up for a long time," he said, "but I was afraid. They made it clear that anyone who stepped out of line would pay for it." Maria added, "It's not just customers who deal with this. It's us too. If you're not the right kind of person, they make your life hell." "I had to fight for every promotion, every opportunity, while watching others get ahead just because they fit the image Luxair wanted." Amelia listened intently, her heart heavy but her resolve hardening. Their stories echoed her own experiences, each one a thread in the larger tapestry of systemic exclusion. "Would you be willing to share this publicly?" she asked gently. Devon hesitated but nodded. "If it means finally holding them accountable, I'll do it." As the day wore on, the pressure on Luxair mounted. Social media buzzed with calls for boycotts, and activist groups began organizing protests at major airports. The cracks in the airline's polished facade were growing wider, and Margaret Delaney was running out of options. By evening, Edward Langston was on Amelia's doorstep, his expression tight and weary. She invited him into her living room, where the atmosphere was charged with unspoken tension. "Miss Harper," he began, his tone carefully measured, "I want to reiterate Luxair's commitment to addressing this issue. We've already begun implementing changes." "Spare me the corporate script," Amelia interrupted, her voice cutting through his rehearsed words. "If you're here to placate me, you're wasting your time." Langston's jaw tightened, but he pressed on. "We're prepared to make significant changes to our policies and practices. We want to work with you to ensure this doesn't happen again." Amelia's eyes narrowed. "And what about the people who've already been harmed? What about the employees who were silenced? The customers who were humiliated?" "Words are meaningless without accountability." Langston hesitated. "What are you asking for?" Amelia leaned forward, her gaze unwavering. "I'm asking for transparency. A full audit of your practices. A platform for those you've wronged to be heard. And tangible changes that go beyond lip service. And I want it all public. Langston exhaled sharply, the weight of her demands sinking in. That's a tall order. It's the bare minimum, Amelia replied. And if Luxair isn't willing to meet it, the public will. As Langston left, the night felt heavier than usual. Amelia stood by the window, her reflection blending with the city lights. She knew the path she'd chosen was fraught with challenges. But there was no turning back. This was bigger than her. It was about confronting a system that thrived on silence and forcing it to answer for its sins. The battle was escalating, and the stakes were rising. But Amelia Harper was ready. The cracks were turning into fractures, and she would see them widened until the whole facade crumbled. The air in Amelia Harper's townhouse felt heavier than usual as she stood in her kitchen, coffee in hand, staring blankly at the morning news playing on the small screen above the counter. The coverage was relentless, clips of protesters gathered outside major airports, holding signs that read, "Justice for all," and "End corporate discrimination." Pundits debated Luxair's response, with some defending the company as unfairly targeted, and others calling it a symbol of systemic inequality. Amelia's phone buzzed on the counter, breaking her focus. It was Claire. "They're cracking." "Amelia," Claire said, her voice tinged with both excitement and exhaustion. "I've just received an email from 3 more former employees willing to go on record. And one of them, you're not going to believe this. She was a senior manager." Amelia straightened, her heart quickening. "A senior manager? Are they willing to speak publicly?" "They want to meet with you first," Claire said. "They're scared, but I think they're ready." Amelia exhaled slowly, her grip tightening around her coffee mug. "Set it up. Today, if possible." The meeting took place in a quiet conference room at a downtown law office. Amelia arrived first, accompanied by Anderson, who had insisted on being there for support. Claire entered a few minutes later, followed by the former senior manager, a woman named Linda Ashford. Linda's presence was striking. She was impeccably dressed, her tailored blazer and neat bun suggesting someone accustomed to commanding respect. Yet, as she took her seat, Amelia noticed the subtle tremor in her hands, the way her eyes darted nervously around the room. "Thank you for meeting with us," Amelia said, her tone warm but firm. "I know this isn't easy." Linda nodded, her lips pressing into a thin line. "It's not," she admitted, "but it's necessary." Over the next hour, Linda recounted her experiences at Luxair. She spoke of subtle biases, the constant pressure to downplay her identity to fit the company's mold, and the silent understanding among employees of color that they were expected to work twice as hard for half the recognition. "I stayed for years," Linda said, her voice tinged with bitterness. "I thought I could change things from the inside. But all I did was survive." Her words hung in the air, a stark reminder of the unspoken battles waged daily by those who dared to occupy spaces where they weren't truly welcome. "Would you be willing to testify?" Anderson asked, breaking the silence. Linda hesitated, her gaze dropping to her hands. I don't know. This could destroy my career." Amelia leaned forward, her voice gentle but resolute. "Linda, your voice could make all the difference. The system thrives on silence. If we don't speak up, it will never change." Linda looked up, meeting Amelia's gaze. For a long moment, the room was silent. Then, with a deep breath, she nodded. "I'll do it." As word spread of Linda's decision to go public, the pressure on Luxair intensified. The company issued a second statement, promising a comprehensive internal review and announcing the suspension of several employees. But the public wasn't satisfied. The protests grew larger, the calls for accountability louder. Margaret Delaney, Luxair's COO, sat in her office, her usually unshakable demeanor showing cracks. She had spent the day fielding calls from panicked board members and angry shareholders. Now, she stared at the growing pile of reports on her desk, complaints from employees, customer testimonials, media coverage. "This is spiraling out of control," she muttered to herself. Her assistant knocked on the door. "Ms. Delaney, Edward Langston is on the line. He says it's urgent." Margaret picked up the phone, her voice sharp. "What is it, Edward?" "She's not backing down," Langston said, his tone grim. "And now with this former manager speaking out, we're going to lose control of the narrative." Margaret pinched the bridge of her nose. "We need to contain this." Offer her whatever it takes to make this go away. She's not interested in money. Langston replied. She wants accountability. Transparency. Margaret's jaw tightened. Then we're in trouble. That evening, Amelia received a call from a reporter at a national news network. They wanted her to appear on a primetime special to discuss the growing controversy. She hesitated. I'm not sure about this, she told Anderson later as they sat in her living room. Going on national television will put a target on my back. And it will amplify your message. Anderson countered. If you're serious about change, this is your chance to reach millions. Amelia stared out the window. The city lights flickering in the darkness. The weight of the decision pressed heavily on her. But deep down, she already knew her answer. The special aired 2 nights later. Amelia sat across from the host. Her posture poised but her hands clenched tightly in her lap. The segment began with a recap of the Luxair controversy, complete with footage of protests, customer testimonials, and the company's increasingly desperate attempts at damage control. When the camera turned to her, Amelia took a deep breath. This isn't just about one company or one incident, she began. It's about a culture that has normalized exclusion, that has made it acceptable to question someone's worth based on the color of their skin or their background. Luxair is just one example. But this happens everywhere, and it's time we stop letting it slide. Her words were measured but powerful, each one landing like a blow. As the interview continued, she shared not just her story but the stories of those who had come forward, weaving a narrative that was impossible to ignore. By the time the segment ended, social media was ablaze. #JusticeForAll was trending again, and Amelia's name was on everyone's lips. But as she sat in the quiet of the studio after the cameras stopped rolling, she felt the enormity of what lay ahead. The battle was far from over. If anything, it was just beginning, and Amelia Harper was ready to see it through, no matter the cost. The air outside Amelia Harper's townhouse was sharp with the chill of early winter. Inside, her living room was warm, but the atmosphere was anything but calm. Papers covered the coffee table, legal documents, printouts of articles, and statements from former Luxair employees. The glow of her laptop illuminated her face as she scrolled through another wave of emails. Many from strangers sharing their own stories of humiliation, exclusion, and systemic injustice. Each message was a small flame, stoking the fire of her resolve. But it was also a reminder of how deep the problem ran. The fight wasn't just hers anymore, it belonged to everyone who had ever been told, in ways subtle and loud, that they didn't belong. At Luxair headquarters, the panic was palpable. Margaret Delaney sat in yet another emergency meeting, the tension in the room thick enough to cut. The board members had turned on one another, their carefully crafted unity shattered by the growing scandal. We need a stronger statement, one member demanded, his voice rising. This vague promise of internal reviews isn't enough. The public wants blood. And whose blood should that be? Another snapped. Heather McAllister has already been terminated. What more do they want? They want systemic change, Margaret said sharply. Silencing the room, she leaned forward, her hands folded on the table. This isn't about one employee or one incident. It's about the culture we've allowed to fester. And if we don't address it, we won't have a company left to fight for. The room fell silent, the weight of her words settling over the group. But silence wasn't agreement. Margaret could see the fear in their eyes, the reluctance to admit that they had let this happen. Meanwhile, Amelia's public profile was growing at a pace she hadn't anticipated. Her appearance on the primetime special had made her a household name overnight. News anchors debated her message. Hashtags bearing her name proliferated. And both supporters and detractors flooded social media with commentary. But with the attention came backlash. That morning, Amelia had received a chilling voicemail. You don't belong here. Go back to where you came from. The words were sharp and venomous, a stark reminder of the risks she faced. Are you okay? Anderson asked when she told him. He had stopped by her office, a rare break from the whirlwind of calls and strategy sessions they'd been engulfed in. Amelia nodded, her expression steely. I'm not going to let them scare me into silence. Anderson's face softened, but his concern lingered. You don't have to do this alone. Amelia met his gaze. I know, but this fight, this moment is bigger than me. That afternoon, Claire arrived with news that sent a ripple of shock through Amelia and her team. Luxair had called an emergency press conference for the following day. Rumors were swirling about a sweeping set of changes. But no one knew the specifics. They're trying to get ahead of this, Claire said, pacing the room. If they frame it right, they could spin this in their favor. Amelia frowned. If they're serious about change, that's one thing. But if this is just another PR stunt, then we'll call them out. Anderson said firmly. We have the evidence, the voices. They can't sweep this under the rug anymore. The next day, the conference room where Luxair's press conference was held was packed with reporters and flashing cameras. Margaret Delaney took the podium, her face calm but her eyes betraying the storm raging behind them. Thank you for being here, she began, her voice measured. Over the past few weeks, Luxair has faced serious allegations about our company culture. We want to acknowledge the pain caused by these incidents and take full responsibility for the failures that led us here. Amelia watched the live stream from her office, her arms crossed tightly over her chest. Margaret continued, outlining a series of actions: mandatory diversity training, an external audit of the company's policies, and the creation of a customer advocacy board. It sounded impressive, but to Amelia, it felt hollow. They're throwing out buzzwords, she said to Anderson, who stood nearby. But where's the accountability? Where's the admission of the systemic rot at their core? As the press conference ended, Amelia's phone buzzed with messages from journalists seeking her reaction. She decided to respond publicly, taking to social media with a statement of her own. I commend Luxair for taking steps toward change, she wrote. But this isn't enough. Words without accountability are meaningless. True change requires acknowledging not just individual incidents but the systems that perpetuate them. The public deserves more than promises. We deserve action. Her statement went viral within hours, reigniting the public's demand for more transparency from Luxair. That evening, as Amelia prepared for yet another late-night strategy session, she received an unexpected call. It was Linda Ashford, the former senior manager who had agreed to testify. There's something you need to know, Linda said, her voice low. I've been contacted by Luxair's legal team. They're offering me a settlement, a big one, but only if I agree to an NDA. Amelia's stomach tightened. It was a classic tactic. Buy silence to protect the company. What are you going to do? She asked. Linda hesitated. I don't know. The money would change my life. But if I sign it, I can't speak out. I can't help you. Amelia closed her eyes, the weight of the decision pressing heavily on her. Linda, I can't tell you what to do. But know this. Your voice has the power to change things, not just for you, but for everyone who comes after you. The line went quiet for a long moment. Then Linda said, I'll think about it. As the night wore on, Amelia felt the strain of the battle she had chosen to fight. The stakes were rising, the challenges multiplying, but so, too, was her resolve. The cracks in Luxair's facade were growing wider, and Amelia Harper intended to ensure that they never closed again. The fight was far from over. And tomorrow, the stakes would be higher than ever. The night was heavy with an uneasy stillness as Amelia Harper sat at her desk. The glow of her laptop illuminating the lines of exhaustion etched into her face. The battle had been relentless. And yet, the weight of it only seemed to deepen with every step forward. She stared at the screen, at the growing archive of testimonials and evidence that now threatened to topple Luxair's carefully constructed facade. Her phone buzzed, breaking the silence. It was Linda Ashford. I've made my decision, Linda said, her voice steady but carrying the weight of a sleepless night. I'm not taking their settlement. Amelia felt a swell of relief, though she kept her voice calm. That couldn't have been easy. It wasn't, Linda admitted, but I realized something. If I take their money, I'm just helping them bury the truth. And I've spent too many years being complicit in their silence. Thank you, Linda, Amelia said softly. Your courage will mean everything to so many people. The next morning, the public's attention was drawn to an explosive new article published by Claire. The headline read, Inside Luxair. Former employees speak out on a culture of discrimination and fear. The piece detailed Linda's testimony alongside that of other employees who had faced years of microaggressions, bias, and systemic exclusion. It painted a damning portrait of a company that had built its success on the backs of people it refused to acknowledge. The article went viral within hours, dominating the news cycle and sparking even more outrage. For Amelia, the article was a victory, but it also marked a turning point. The gloves were off now. And she knew Luxair wouldn't go down without a fight. At Luxair headquarters, the mood was grim. Margaret Delaney stormed into the boardroom, her usual composure replaced by a simmering fury. "This is getting out of hand," she snapped, slamming a copy of Claire's article onto the table. "Our stock is plummeting, protests are disrupting our operations, and now we're being accused of a systemic culture of discrimination." Edward Langston shifted uneasily in his seat. "We've made public commitments to change. We're implementing new training programs." "It's not enough," Margaret interrupted. "The public doesn't care about promises anymore. They want results. They want blood." "Then what do you propose?" one board member asked cautiously. Margaret's expression hardened. "We need a scapegoat. Someone to take the fall so the rest of us can move forward." The room fell silent, the weight of her words sinking in. Margaret looked around, her gaze sharp and unyielding. "We built this company on the illusion of perfection. Now we need to protect that illusion, no matter the cost." Amelia's day was no less intense. Calls flooded in from journalists, activists, and legal teams offering their support. But one call stood out. It was from an anonymous source claiming to have access to internal Luxair documents, emails, memos, and reports that could expose the company's deliberate efforts to suppress complaints of discrimination. "Why are you coming forward now?" Amelia asked, her tone cautious but curious. "Because it's time," the voice on the other end said. "I've watched this company get away with too much for too long. People need to know the truth." The source agreed to send the documents anonymously. And when they arrived that evening, Amelia's breath caught as she read through them. The memos detailed strategies for handling complaints, including offering settlements with strict non-disclosure agreements and discrediting employees who refused to comply. One email, in particular, stood out. "We need to maintain our image of inclusivity at all costs. Negative stories must be suppressed, and any individuals causing disruption should be dealt with swiftly." Amelia stared at the words, a cold fury rising within her. This wasn't just negligence, it was a calculated effort to silence dissent and protect a toxic culture. The following day, armed with the new evidence, Amelia held her own press conference. Standing before a crowd of reporters, she spoke with a calm but unyielding conviction. "This is not just about Luxair," she began. "It's about every company, every institution that has allowed systemic discrimination to thrive under the guise of professionalism. Luxair is a symptom of a much larger disease, and it's time we addressed it." She presented the internal documents, laying bare the company's strategies for suppressing complaints and silencing victims. The room buzzed with shock and anger as reporters scrambled to capture every word. As the conference ended, Amelia felt a mix of exhaustion and determination. The evidence was out there now, undeniable and unspinable. Luxair could no longer hide behind promises and platitudes. That evening, as Amelia returned home, she found herself reflecting on the weight of what she had unleashed. The fight had grown far beyond her initial encounter in the lounge. It was no longer about one company or one incident, it was about challenging the unspoken rules that had governed her entire life. Her phone buzzed with a text from Claire. "You did it. The truth is out. Now we see what they'll do." Amelia set the phone down and gazed out her window at the city below. The fight was far from over. But for the first time, she felt a glimmer of hope. The silence had been broken, and there was no turning back. Tomorrow, the battle would continue, and Amelia Harper would be ready. The world felt different when Amelia Harper woke up the next morning. The air outside her window carried a peculiar stillness, a kind that comes just before the thunderclap. Her townhouse, normally a haven of order and focus, was alive with activity phones ringing, laptops humming, the muted voices of her team bouncing off the walls. Every movement, every sound felt like part of a larger crescendo. The fallout from her press conference was immediate. The leaked Luxair documents were everywhere, plastered across headlines, dissected on talk shows, and debated in town halls. But the storm brewing wasn't just about Luxair anymore. It was about a system exposed, a mirror held up to an America that still grappled with the unspoken specter of exclusion and prejudice. Margaret Delaney sat at her desk at Luxair headquarters, her normally impeccable office now a battlefield of scattered papers, glowing screens, and tense voices over speakerphones. She listened as the board chair demanded answers. "This is an existential crisis," he barked. "Our customers are fleeing, our investors are pulling out, And the press is eating us alive. What the hell is your plan? Margaret, ever the picture of composure, took a deep breath. We need to make a bold move, she said. We have to go beyond damage control and demonstrate real accountability. We must offer Amelia Harper a seat at the table. The line went silent for a moment before erupting into protests. Are you out of your mind? Someone yelled. She's the one tearing us apart. She's exposing us, Margaret corrected, her voice sharp. And if we don't act, she'll be the one to bury us. Meanwhile, Amelia was grappling with the weight of her own momentum. The press conference had turned her into a lightning rod, and with it came both allies and enemies. Strangers stopped her in the street to thank her for her courage. But her inbox also brimmed with hate mail, each word a reminder of the forces she was up against. As she prepared for yet another media appearance, Anderson entered the room, his expression grim. We've received a formal invitation from Luxair. They want to meet. Amelia arched a brow. And what do they hope to achieve? They're framing it as a collaborative effort to rebuild trust. Anderson replied, but you and I both know they're desperate. Amelia leaned back in her chair. Considering, if I meet with them, it'll be on my terms. No more half measures. No more empty promises. The meeting was set for the next day. And Luxair pulled out all the stops. They rented a private conference room in a sleek downtown skyscraper, its floor-to-ceiling windows offering panoramic views of the city. But the grandeur did little to mask the tension that crackled in the air. Amelia arrived with Anderson and Claire, her presence commanding even in the face of the company's carefully orchestrated charm offensive. Margaret Delaney greeted her at the door, her smile strained but professional. Miss Harper, Margaret began, extending a hand. Thank you for coming. Amelia shook her hand firmly. Let's not waste time. Ms. Delaney, I assume you have something meaningful to offer. Margaret gestured for her to sit. We want to acknowledge the harm caused by our company's actions, she began, and we believe the best way forward is to work together. We're prepared to offer you a role as an advisor, with full oversight of our reform efforts. The offer hung in the air, heavy with implication. Amelia could feel the eyes of everyone in the room on her. Waiting for her response, she leaned forward, her gaze piercing. This isn't about me, she said. This is about the people you've harmed, the culture you've cultivated, and the systems you've protected. If you're serious about change, then here's what I want. She laid out her demands. A public apology not just to her but to all those who had been silenced, a commitment to transparency, including making the findings of their internal audit public, and reparations for employees and customers who had been wronged. Margaret's composure faltered for a brief moment, but she nodded. We'll consider your terms. No, Amelia said firmly. You'll accept them, or I'll ensure the world knows that even now, Luxair refuses to take full accountability. The tension in the room was palpable. Margaret exchanged a look with her team, then nodded. You'll have our answer by tomorrow. The next 24 hours were a blur. News of the meeting leaked, fueling speculation and intensifying the already raging public discourse. Amelia's name dominated headlines, her face appearing on every major network. Protesters gathered outside Luxair's offices, their chants echoing through the streets. By the time Margaret called the next day, Amelia already knew what the answer would be. We're accepting your terms, Margaret said, her voice tight. The board has approved the measures you proposed. Amelia allowed herself a small, fleeting smile. Good, now let's get to work. The announcement sent shockwaves through the industry. Luxair's admission of guilt and commitment to reform was unprecedented. And while many praised the move, others criticized it as too little, too late. For Amelia, it was a victory, but it was far from the end. As she stood on the balcony of her townhouse that evening, the city sprawled out before her. She felt the weight of what she had accomplished but also the enormity of what lay ahead. The battle had broken through one facade, but there were countless others still standing. Her phone buzzed with a message from Claire. You did it. This is history. Amelia stared at the message for a moment before typing a response. It's a start, but history isn't enough. We're just getting started. As the night deepened, Amelia Harper stood ready for the next chapter of the fight. The storm had broken, but the winds of change were only beginning to howl. The morning light poured through the glass walls of the skyscraper where Luxair had called a press conference. The air was thick with anticipation, the kind that settles when the world knows something monumental is about to unfold. Reporters jostled for position, their voices overlapping as cameras were set up and microphones adjusted. At the front of the room stood a polished podium bearing the Luxair logo, now a symbol of reckoning as much as travel. Amelia Harper stood behind the curtain, waiting for her cue. The weight of the moment pressed against her, but her resolve was firm. Margaret Delaney had asked her to join this conference, to be part of the company's public admission of guilt. It was a calculated move, meant to restore public faith. But for Amelia, it was a chance to ensure the truth was not sanitized or spun into something palatable. Anderson stood beside her, his expression a mix of pride and concern. "You're about to walk into history," he said. Amelia gave him a small, tight smile. History doesn't come without a fight. When Margaret stepped up to the podium, the room fell silent. Her tone was composed, but the cracks in her polished facade were visible to anyone who cared to look. "Over the past weeks, Luxair has faced allegations that have shaken us to our core," she began. "Today, we acknowledge the harm caused by our company's actions. We failed to uphold the values we claimed to stand for, and we must now face the consequences of those failures." She paused, the weight of her words sinking into the room. Then she gestured toward Amelia, who stepped forward with measured confidence. The room erupted in camera flashes and murmurs, but Amelia ignored them. She took her place at the podium, her presence commanding. "My name is Amelia Harper," she began, her voice steady. "I'm not here today to praise Luxair for its promises or to applaud its efforts to rebuild. I'm here to ensure that the people who have been silenced and dismissed are finally heard." She glanced at the audience, meeting their eyes one by one. "This isn't just about one company. It's about the unspoken truths that permeate our institutions, our workplaces, our everyday lives. It's about the quiet exclusions, the subtle biases, and the systems that thrive on silence." The room was utterly still, the weight of her words pressing down on everyone present. "Luxair has agreed to take significant steps toward accountability and reform," she continued. "But let me be clear. This is just the beginning. Change doesn't happen in boardrooms or press conferences. It happens when we hold ourselves and each other accountable. Every single day." Her voice sharpened, slicing through the air. "If we're going to build a better future, we have to confront the past, not just acknowledge it, but dismantle it." When she stepped back from the podium, the room erupted into applause. But Amelia barely heard it. Her mind was already on what came next. The aftermath of the press conference was both immediate and overwhelming. Luxair's stock continued to dip as investors grappled with the fallout. But public sentiment began to shift. For the first time, there was a glimmer of faith that real change might be possible. Activists and advocates rallied behind Amelia, using her as a symbol of what could be achieved through courage and persistence. But the road ahead was anything but smooth. Luxair's internal audit uncovered even more damning evidence: instances of employees being retaliated against for speaking out, customers being systematically excluded from loyalty programs, and executives turning a blind eye to discriminatory practices. Each revelation added fuel to the fire, and Amelia found herself thrust into the role of not just a whistleblower but a movement leader. Late one evening, Amelia sat alone in her townhouse, her laptop open to a report detailing Luxair's promised reforms. The company had agreed to implement sweeping changes, including the establishment of an independent oversight board and reparations for affected employees and customers. But Amelia knew promises were only as strong as the will to enforce them. Her phone buzzed, breaking her focus. It was Claire. "You're not going to believe this," Claire said, her voice tinged with urgency. "I just got word that several other major corporations are quietly re-evaluating their own practices because of what's happening with Luxair." Amelia leaned back in her chair, her mind racing. "Good," she said after a moment. "It's about time." Claire hesitated. "But there's something else. I've been hearing rumors that some of Luxair's board members are pushing back against the reforms. They're trying to protect their own interests." Amelia's jaw tightened. "Let them try." The following weeks were a whirlwind of meetings, media appearances, and strategy sessions. Amelia and her team worked tirelessly to ensure that Luxair's promises didn't become empty gestures. She met with employees who had suffered under the company's toxic culture, listened to their stories, and amplified their voices. But with every step forward, there were forces working to push back. Anonymous threats began to surface, emails warning Amelia to back off, whispers of attempts to discredit her. One evening, As she left a meeting, she noticed a black car idling across the street. Its headlights trained on her. It drove off the moment she approached, leaving a trail of unease in its wake. Anderson confronted her about it the next day. "You need security," he said. "This is getting dangerous." Amelia shook her head. "I won't be intimidated. That's what they want. It's not just about you." Anderson insisted. "You have a responsibility to the people who are counting on you." The words hit their mark, and Amelia reluctantly agreed to take precautions. But her resolve remained unshaken. The breaking point came when a leaked memo from Luxair's board revealed attempts to undermine the Oversight Board's authority. The public backlash was swift and brutal, forcing Margaret Delaney to call an emergency meeting. Amelia was invited, and this time, she didn't hold back. "You brought me in to help rebuild trust," she said, her voice razor sharp. "But trust isn't a PR strategy. It's earned through action. And if you undermine the very reforms you promised, you'll prove to the world that nothing has changed." The room was silent, the weight of her words undeniable. Margaret, for once, looked genuinely chastened. "You're right," Margaret said finally. "We can't afford to fail. Not this time." As Amelia walked out of the meeting, the sun was setting over the city, casting a golden glow on the buildings around her. For the first time in weeks, she felt a flicker of hope, not because the fight was over, but because she had seen what was possible when people refused to back down. The battle against Luxair had started as a personal fight for justice. Now, it was a movement, one that had the power to reshape not just a company but an entire culture. And Amelia Harper was ready for whatever came next. The morning air was heavy with the kind of tension that preceded a storm. Though no clouds darkened the sky, for Amelia Harper, the storm was already here. She sat at her dining table, surrounded by her team, the faint hum of muted news reports playing in the background. Luxair had officially implemented the reforms they'd promised. Reparations were being paid. The Oversight Board was established, and training programs had been rolled out across the company. But the victory felt precarious. For every step forward, there were whispers of resistance. Board members quietly questioning the changes, employees grumbling about unnecessary diversity initiatives, and public figures debating whether the backlash against Luxair had gone too far. It was clear, change, real change, was harder to hold onto than to ignite. And then there was the email. It arrived late the night before, buried among dozens of other messages. At first, Amelia hadn't noticed it, but something about the subject line stopped her. "You need to see this." The email was from an anonymous sender and contained an attachment, a scanned copy of a document stamped with Luxair's corporate logo. The contents chilled her. The document outlined a strategy to limit the power of the newly established Oversight Board. Phrases like minimize external interference and retain executive autonomy stood out in bold. It was clear, while Luxair had publicly committed to reform, parts of its leadership were quietly plotting to weaken the very structures meant to hold them accountable. "What are we going to do?" Anderson asked the next morning, pacing the room like a caged animal. "If this gets out, it'll undo everything. We can't let that happen," Claire added. She was seated across from Amelia, her notebook open, her pen poised. "We need to get ahead of this." Amelia stared at the document, her fingers brushing the edge of the table. "We don't just expose it," she said finally, her voice calm but resolute. "We leverage it." Claire frowned. "Leverage it how?" Amelia met her gaze. "If Luxair's leadership is already working against their own reforms, then we need to show them what happens when they try to backpedal. We need the public to see this not as a company taking responsibility, but as one desperately clinging to its old ways." That afternoon, Amelia and her team convened a meeting with members of the Oversight Board and several former Luxair employees who had become outspoken advocates. They laid out the contents of the leaked document and discussed their next move. "This can't just be about exposing them," Amelia said. "It has to be about forcing their hand. If we can pressure them into not just upholding these reforms but expanding them, we can ensure they can't quietly dismantle this later." The room buzzed with agreement. Plans were made for another press conference, this one centered on the document and the need for greater accountability. Amelia could feel the weight of the moment pressing against her, but she refused to buckle under it. When the press conference was held 2 days later, the room was packed with reporters, activists, and even a few corporate leaders who had started to distance themselves from Luxair. Amelia stood at the podium, holding a copy of the leaked document in her hand. "This is what happens when systems of power are threatened," she began, her voice steady. "This document is proof that Luxair's leadership, even now, is working to undermine the reforms they promised. It's a reminder that promises mean nothing without accountability." She held the document up for the cameras. "But let me be clear. This is not just about one company. This is about the systems that enable companies like Luxair to operate without consequence. It's about the structures that allow injustice to thrive in silence." Her voice rose, the fire in her words igniting the room. "We are not asking for change. We are demanding it, and we will not stop until it is undeniable, unshakable, and permanent." The crowd erupted into applause. But Amelia's focus was already on what came next. The fallout from the press conference was swift. Luxair's leadership faced renewed scrutiny, with calls for resignations and even a shareholder revolt. Meanwhile, Amelia's movement began to expand beyond Luxair, targeting other corporations with histories of systemic exclusion. What had started as a personal fight had become a nationwide reckoning. But the pushback was equally fierce. Anonymous threats became more frequent, some veiled, others explicit. Conservative pundits accused Amelia of overreach, painting her as a radical intent on tearing down American business. Social media buzzed with both praise and vitriol, each comment a reminder of the divided world she was challenging. One night, as Amelia sat in her living room, the weight of it all threatened to crush her. She stared at the flickering city lights outside her window, the distant hum of traffic a strange comfort. Her phone buzzed, pulling her from her thoughts. It was a message from Linda Ashford. "I just wanted to say thank you for fighting for all of us. You're making more of a difference than you know." Amelia smiled faintly, her resolve hardening. The fight was bigger than her, but it was hers to lead. The weeks that followed were a whirlwind of progress and resistance. Luxair announced the resignation of several key executives and expanded its oversight board to include independent advocates. Other companies began implementing their own reforms, eager to avoid the fate that had befallen Luxair. But the battle was far from over. As Amelia stood in the middle of the chaos she had helped unleash, she felt both the weight of her responsibility and the promise of what lay ahead. The fire she had started was spreading, consuming the old ways and illuminating the path to something new. This was no longer just a reckoning. It was a revolution, and Amelia Harper was ready to see it through. The grand ballroom was silent, save for the quiet murmur of anticipation. Rows of chairs were filled with faces turned toward the stage, their expressions a mixture of hope, determination, and curiosity. The audience was a tapestry of identities, spanning generations and backgrounds, united by one thing: the need for change. Amelia Harper stood behind the curtain, her heart steady despite the weight of the moment. The past months had been a whirlwind of battles fought in courtrooms, boardrooms, and streets. She had faced resistance from powerful forces, endured threats and smear campaigns, and shouldered the expectations of millions. And yet, here she was, about to address the largest gathering of advocates, activists, and leaders she had ever faced. She glanced at Anderson, who stood beside her, his eyes, usually sharp with strategy, softened as he offered a small nod. "This is your moment, Amelia," he said. "You've earned it." Amelia didn't respond. Instead, she took a deep breath and stepped forward as the curtain parted. The applause that greeted her was thunderous, the kind that rattles walls and shakes foundations. She approached the podium, her posture regal, her presence commanding. When the applause subsided, Amelia began to speak. "This journey began with a moment," she said, her voice carrying across the room. "A single moment in a lounge where I was made to feel small, unwelcome, unworthy. But that moment was not unique. It was a thread in a larger tapestry, one that has been woven into the fabric of our lives for far too long." She paused, her eyes scanning the audience. "You all know this tapestry. You've seen its patterns in workplaces, in schools, in everyday interactions. It's the unspoken exclusion, the quiet condescension, the subtle reminders that some of us are seen as less than. And for generations, we have been told to accept it, to endure it, to be silent." Her voice grew stronger, rising like a wave. "But silence is not the answer. Silence is complicity. And today, we are here to say, no more. The audience erupted into applause. But Amelia raised a hand, calling for quiet. The fight against injustice is not easy. She continued. It is exhausting. It is painful. It forces us to confront uncomfortable truths not just about the world, but about ourselves. It demands sacrifice. And yet, it is the only way forward. Amelia's mind flashed back to the moments that had defined this fight. The protests outside Luxair's offices, where strangers chanted her name. The tearful testimonies of employees who had suffered in silence for years. The late-night strategy sessions where exhaustion hung heavy in the air but no one dared quit. And then, the victories. Luxair's sweeping reforms. The resignation of executives who had perpetuated harm. The ripple effect that forced other corporations to examine their own practices. Each victory had come at a cost. But each one had brought them closer to a world where justice wasn't just an ideal but a reality. We are not here to tear down, Amelia said, her voice softening. We are here to build. To build systems that value equity over exclusion. To build workplaces where everyone has a seat at the table. To build a culture where dignity is not a privilege but a right. Her gaze sharpened, her tone turning resolute. But building requires vigilance. It requires commitment. And it requires that we never, ever grow complacent. The systems we are fighting against are resilient. And they will push back. But so are we. And we will not stop. The room was silent now. The weight of her words hanging heavy in the air. Amelia took a deep breath, allowing the moment to settle before delivering her final message. Each of you has a role to play in this fight, she said. It is not enough to stand on the sidelines. It is not enough to cheer from afar. You must act. You must speak. You must lead. Because the fight for justice is not the work of one person. It is the work of a movement. And today, that movement is us. The applause began slowly, like the first drops of rain. Before swelling into a storm, people rose to their feet, their faces alight with determination. Amelia stepped back from the podium, her heart swelling with a mix of pride and humility. This was not her victory. It was theirs. It was everyone's. Later that evening, as the crowd dispersed and the ballroom emptied, Amelia found herself alone on the stage. She gazed out at the now empty chairs, her thoughts drifting to her mother. She could almost hear her voice, steady and full of quiet strength. Never let them define you. Amelia, define yourself. A tear slipped down her cheek, but she didn't brush it away. It was a tear born not of sorrow but of resolve. The fight was far from over. There were still battles to be fought, systems to dismantle, and lives to uplift. But for the first time, Amelia felt a glimmer of something she hadn't dared to feel before: hope. As she stepped off the stage, the words she had spoken echoed in her mind. The fight for justice is not the work of one person. It is the work of a movement. And tonight, that movement was unstoppable.